I want to welcome back friend of the show and economic historian, currently serving as Senior Research Fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. His latest piece we're going to talk about here breaks down the ever so nuanced positions of Dr. Anthony Fauci's. Ladies and gentlemen, Phil Magness. Mr. Magness, welcome back to Sports, Clicks, and Politics. Thank you for giving us some of your time. Did I see recently you're in Texas?
I am. That's been a short business trip down to the Lone Star State, or as I say these days, the free part of the country.
I'm jealous. I said we're still stuck up here in New York, which is not the opposite. It's the reciprocal of Texas at this point. So before we jump into the your most recent article here, when we had you back on in October, we were kind of breaking down whether or not we thought the lockdown measures that were in place in some of these parts of our state and the country and in the world, whether or not they were actually doing any good, working, doing as they were billed us as to help stop spread the virus. Has anything changed, or has there been any new information that kind of either confirms your position, or has you've been reassessed that lockdown position?
Well, that's the fascinating thing. I think the last time we talked, the big line that was coming out of the epidemiology profession, or at least its pro-lockdown side, was this claim that lockdowns were a thing of the past. They were something we did in the spring, and they worked, and it was now a straw man to even bring that specter up again. That was the big narrative back in September, October, November of last year, and then large parts of the world locked down again for the fall and winter wave. We saw that in Europe. We saw that in several states again in the United States. And it turned out that the winter wave seemed to happen more or less as it would have anyway. We can compare parts of the country and different nations around the world that went into a second lockdown against those that did not throughout the fall and winter wave, and basically the results are the same. There's no evidence that these measures were effective at stemming the tide of the virus, and in fact many of the places that locked down a second or a third time had much worse records in the more recent wave than places that did not.
And when we talked last, it was just recently the Great Barrington Declaration had been put out, and you guys were kind of instrumental in helping facilitate that there at the American Institute for Economic Research. And we, like I said, it had just kind of been out there when we talked. At the time, it was there was quite an acceptance from tens of thousands of health and medical professionals, but the Twitter world and the folks who were pro-lockdown seemed to push back immediately. That doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. It seems more that they have really just tried to tear down the Great Barrington Declarations ever since it's been launched. So, what's been your experience kind of working closely with that group?
Well, it's been depressing to see the state of the scientific conversation. When we launched the Great Barrington Declaration, I think it was a genuine hope of all three scientists that were involved, and then the many thousands of other scientists that signed on, that this would provoke a much-needed scientific conversation, scientific debate over the effectiveness of lockdowns, the costs that are associated with lockdowns, and other strategies, other approaches we could take to dealing with the pandemic after several months of the lockdown approach being tried and failing over and over again. We didn't get that conversation, unfortunately, because people that were wedded to the earlier version of the policy would have nothing of it. They were path-dependent on continuing to repeat and do the same thing that they had tried and failed at in the fall, tried and failed at again in the summer, and now have tried and failed at through the second wave of the virus. So what it really quickly turned into was not a scientific dialogue, but one of the most bizarre and extreme vilification campaigns I've ever witnessed on a matter of public policy, even to the point that the dominant response we got from ostensibly well-respected, highly regarded, accomplished epidemiologists on the pro-lockdown side delved right into outright conspiracy theory. There was a claim going around at one point that the Koch brothers had paid us off to issue the Great Barrington Declaration, which is completely false. That morphed into another claim that the British Ministry of Defense supposedly had some bizarre financial contact to some webmaster that was alleged to have created our website, even though the guy lives in Wales and had absolutely nothing to do with us. And these are being put out by supposedly mainstream epidemiologists at Duke University and Harvard and Yale and other elite institutions that are supposed to be scientific communicators on this particular issue. But instead, what they were doing is they were playing the politics of vilification to try to discredit any challenge to the policy that they had settled on back in the spring and have not deviated away from.
Man, it's just a sad state of affairs at this point. Let me ask you this. We talked about lockdowns and the cost of lockdowns. So a two-part question. Overall deaths in the United States, what do they look like? And then if you break it down by age, how much of this could be attributed to the lockdowns versus how much could be attributed to COVID? I don't expect exact numbers, but just general ideas.
Right. So it's a really tricky question to break down the deaths on actually where they're coming from. What we do know is this disease has a very pronounced age gradient. In other words, what it means is it's really not all that severe for most younger and healthier people, but it gets very, very severe as you advance up in age, and also aging comes with other medical issues, medical conditions referred to as comorbidities. So you start to get into the territory of 65 plus, 70 plus. It's a really serious disease. This is why we emphasize vaccination should be prioritized for people in those age demographics and people with other medical conditions. Yet if you're talking about something like a school-age child, or a college student, the risk of a severe case of COVID is actually very small. We see this in the CDC's own numbers. So just assessing that automatically tells us that a general one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with the pandemic through society, i.e. shutting it down, is probably not suitable for this disease. In fact, it's very mistaken in the way that we've gone about addressing this disease. So just based on the data that we know, we find that lockdowns are a very blunt instrument that's probably not well designed to even do what it claims to do.
Yeah, and like I said, I know we have, we mentioned you being in Texas, and obviously we have instances, place like state of Florida compared to where we are in New York. So do we have, is there economic data? I mean, is it too soon to kind of compare the states yet to say, hey, Florida handled it completely different than some of the states up in like the Northeast, and is there a way to kind of differentiate their economic outcomes at this point?
Well, just in social sciences in general, the one thing that we always look for are counterfactuals. And it's a really tricky area to isolate and pick the correct counterfactuals. There's all sorts of statistical methods to do this. But if we look for two or more areas of the country or two or more countries themselves that use very different policies, we can see natural experiments emerging in the real world by putting them side by side to see what happened. And you can kind of eyeball it throughout the pandemic. You can also run sophisticated statistical models to show more precisely fine-tuned cases of this around specific events. But one thing that we are seeing, especially through the second wave, is that states like Florida, which remain completely open, states like Texas, which were relatively open, and then toward the second wave's tail end, they started to very rapidly reopen. This was the Governor Abbott's order from the beginning of the month, where he basically voided all of the previous existing coronavirus restrictions. And yet you have other places like New York and California that have either remained locked down or have been very slow to relax their restrictions. Although Gavin Newsom was taking some heat, Andrew Cuomo's taking heat, so they've actually started to back away from some of those. But still, they've been much slower to relax their restrictions than places like Texas and Florida. But if you overlay these states against each other, you see that they all had basically the same course during the second wave. And in fact, New York and California were doing much worse on several metrics, in addition to basically obliterating their economies. So unemployment tends to be much worse in places like California and New York than these other locales that had more or less the same or better experience with weathering the coronavirus, but didn't destroy their economies in the same way.
Yeah, and obviously we're experiencing that firsthand. I guess we're about maybe 2 or 3 sexual harassment charges against our governor away from maybe a removing of the mask mandate. So we got that to look forward to.
Exactly.
All right, so let's move to your article, The Many Variants of Fauci's Mutating COVID Advice. I I have been paying attention to your critique of Dr. Fauci along the way. I share in it a lot of what you say. Like, I feel like no matter what questions he's asked, he can answer it. He's answering it on both sides of or he has two answers to every question, so he can kind of make sure that he's right in the long run or wrong in the long run. It doesn't really matter. Like, he just covers his bases, I guess. In your article, you talk about his messaging around reinfection and in relation masks. So let's go back. Let's talk about Fauci early on in the pandemic and talk about reinfection and then how that has changed through the course of time here.
Yeah. So Fauci, very early on, he was actually fairly sound on the science about the possibility of reinfection. Some of his first comments on the issue, and this dates all the way back to like last March and April, people were asking, well, if you get the disease and you recover, what are the chances of having immunity? And Fauci stuck to fairly doctrinaire epidemiology, which says that, for most respiratory viruses of this nature, and in fact, other previous coronaviruses that we know about, there is at least some lasting immunity into the medium term. We don't know for certain that it's going to be a year or 5 years or 10 years with a new virus. That's simply not the nature of how science advances. But we do know from previous experience that immunity is, in fact, likely, at least for some degree of time. And Fauci was outright stating this back in March and April of 2020. That was a message that he adhered to. He even made several claims on nationally syndicated news broadcasts and press conferences where people asked him about, can you get reinfected from the coronavirus? And he said, it's extremely unlikely, and if it happens, it will only be very rare. Basically, odd cases that have some other medical complication, such as a compromised immune system, may be very susceptible to becoming reinfected. But for the normal person, for the average person, reinfection is not a huge risk.
And so how is that different than what he's telling us today as the vaccine was being rolled out?
Well, he's pivoted his message throughout the last year, and I document this in the article. And it's not just changing his message once or twice, it's changing it dozens of times, often only weeks or days apart. And Fauci stuck to that message originally of kind of discounting the notion of reinfection being a major or severe threat through most of the spring and summer of 2020. Then around the early fall, so September, October, right around the time that the Great Barrington Declaration was coming out, and some of those messages were starting to be offered around herd immunity as an alternative basis for a strategy than lockdowns, Fauci pivoted in the way that he was depicting the risk of reinfection. So even though he had been downplaying it for most of the spring and summer, he starts changing his message and pointing out those obscure, rare cases where somebody was confirmed to have had a reinfection, and then really casting the seed of doubt and says, well, we don't know about herd immunity because there's this one case that we read about from Europe where an elderly Dutch lady, I think she was an 89-year-old Dutch lady with advanced leukemia and a severely compromised immune system, had been confirmed to get a second round of COVID after recovering, and unfortunately died of it. So he trotted out that study as if it was now the specter of reinfection was the reason why we can't rely on a herd immunity oriented strategy that's an alternative to the lockdowns. So we already had this pivot, and the pivot was strictly political, not because of the changing science. It's he needed a new line of argument to rebuff the Great Barrington Declaration, rebuff the herd immunity science that was being put forth as an alternative to his control of the political narrative.
So Dr. Fauci said that the South African variant in particular, it appears as if the South African variant, you could get that as if you had no immunity whatsoever. That was the rough language he used, especially for older people. I found that to be misleading, to say the least. But like most things, there's a kernel of truth in what he says, and then it's just expounded upon far too much, far too many assumptions that are then included. Could you go through that a little bit?
Yeah, so the South African variant, was discovered in the last few months, and this is what viruses do. They mutate, even though it's the same virus. It has different features to the genetic code that go into it, and they play out slightly differently in different populations. What Fauci did was he took some studies that occurred very early in 2021. They came out in January, February, and March, where they looked at the possibility of reinfection in the South African variant. And one of the studies found a single case of an individual who had previously been infected last year with some other variant of the coronavirus and came down with it again a second time. So one single case, and the study was very guarded in its language. It said, we actually need to investigate this further. We don't know if this is a common thing. We've just found one case, and it shows that this is something we should look into. And it actually sounds a lot like some of the previous studies that occurred in the fall, where they found reinfections such as the elderly Dutch lady. A couple other cases have been found where reinfection has indeed occurred, but it's extremely rare. And then there was a second study that came out, and this was connected to one of the virus vaccine trials, and it found suggested evidence that a very small minority of people that went through the trials may have been reinfected, although it didn't have as high of a level of rigor to differentiate that, because you need testing both in between the two times that the person was infected to see that they truly recovered, and it's not just like a latent case that's carrying over. But this study also suggested, yes, there may be a small minority that is susceptible to reinfection from the South African variant. Fauci took that, goes on CNN and says, well, people are getting reinfected all over the place. South Africa is telling us that you have no immunity, you have no protection if you had it previously and you are exposed to this new variant. So he took a very narrow, measured scientific claim and wildly exaggerated it in apocalyptic directions, and did so at a time when he's making the case of why we still need to wear masks, why we still need to have lockdowns, still need to have social distancing restrictions. So again, it's his message pivoting another time just to affirm the political positions that he wants to maintain.
And so he mentioned that South African variant in a engagement with Dr. Rand Paul. He used that as the reason why, kind of to defend Dr. Paul's assertion that masks are theater.
Especially for somebody who's been vaccinated and who had it and recovered.
Right. So I think his messaging around masks has kind of shifted along the way too. Obviously, we're well aware of his early interview where he basically said, people shouldn't be wearing masks, and then obviously a change there. So other than that, I mean, he's clearly gone to the double masks, the triple masks. What's been your assessment of Fauci's assessment of mask wearing in general?
Well, it's almost a point of comical absurdity now. He was very public in stating that masks were not effective. There was no evidence behind them. This was the famous 60 Minutes interview he gave last March. And he was not only just saying that maybe we should hold off on the masks till the science comes in. He's saying, no, we have no science behind masks that says that they are necessary. And then he completely changes course on that in a matter of months when that becomes the new political narrative. Mask mandates suddenly become like the magic bullet that's going to stop coronavirus from surging again in the fall. Therefore, we all needed to enact them, and Fauci changed his messaging, even admitted that he claims now that he lied in the original commentary that he made on masks back in last March, because he thought that there was a shortage at the hospitals. He said, well, I told the noble lie to the public because I wanted to make sure that hospitals had enough masks. And that already has ethical questions associated with it, because it's casting doubt on public health advice. It's misleading people, even if it's supposedly being done for a noble purpose, as he claimed. And yet we've seen this play out throughout the year. The messaging from Fauci shifted again from not just one mask to two masks. And he rode that for a little while. He started appearing in public with multiple masks on. I think that happened after the famous baseball game incident when he was caught sitting in the stand without a mask. He switched from that to two masks. And then there was a brief point, I think it was in January 2021, when he said, well, maybe two masks aren't necessary. We need to go back to one mask. And that lasted about a week. Then a new CDC study came out pushing the two mask solution, and it's been like an upward trajectory ever since. But again, It's a guy who has no consistency to his scientific message. Quite the contrary, what he's doing is he's pivoting it around as the politics need him to, and as he needs to make a specific argument to keep one of these measures in place that he's really staked his political career on.
God bless you. So I don't know if you looked into this at all. Back during the days of SARS-CoV-1, 15 years ago, 16 years ago, Australia actually threatened to fine businesses if they started over-promising on the effectiveness of masks at stopping transmission.
We saw measures like that in several places in the world. I think even for a moment in Germany, they had restrictions on people that were trying to enforce masks, like back in the spring, and that shifted not only to a mask mandate, but then some parts of Germany they were using N95 mask mandates. So it's been all over the map on this. The science has been all over the place.
Does it ever feel like we're playing for the 1% exception at all times instead of the 99% odds of like, look, the mask that I wear literally says right on the warning label, will not stop transmission of COVID. Why am I wearing this thing? Like, for the 1% of particles that it's going to stop? Same with lockdown. Same with all of this stuff. Like, well, we don't know about asymptomatic spread. It could happen. We don't know about children transmitting. It could happen. We don't know about reinfection. It could happen. Like, yeah, but why are we not playing for the 99% odds? Why is every public policy decision coming out as the 1% exception?
Well, this is the science of speculation that has characterized Fauci's career, not only through the coronavirus, but going back decades when he assumed his current position at the NIH, which I think was in 1983. I mean, here's a guy that's been in office for 40 years and is the highest paid bureaucrat in the entire federal government, makes more money than the president. There's a reason that someone like that stays around for so long, and it's not because they're a great scientist, it's because they're a great politician. I kind of liken him to a J. Edgar Hoover type of a figure more than a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. He's someone who knows how to navigate a half dozen presidential administrations, and not only navigate them, but to continue rising in power and salary and authority until he gets all the way up to the top. And we know this from Fauci's earliest public forays into epidemiology came from the AIDS crisis in the early 1980s. So I looked into this a few months ago. Yeah, he was the NIH's point man, spokesman on AIDS. And if you look at his public rhetoric back then, it's the exact same pattern we've seen in the coronavirus, where he goes out and he makes increasingly speculative statements, bold statements that are based on maybe a kernel of scientific evidence or some speculation about some scientific evidence, but he presents them to the public as if this is the fact, this is the authority that's coming out of the government. And it turns out later that that speculation was wrong, and yet he never takes accountability for it. He just pivots his message to something completely different. The famous example being in 1983, he wrote an article speculating that AIDS could be transmitted by regular household contact from, if you had a cousin or an uncle or a brother or sister living in your household and they were sitting around the dinner table, they might be able to transmit AIDS to you. We now know this is complete scientific nonsense, complete bunk. But Fauci wrote this horrendously irresponsible article in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1983, where he said it might be possible to transmit AIDS through household contact, and if that happens, all hell is going to break loose. This is picked up in the press, and what does the New York Times, the Associated Press, all these other newspapers do the next day? They run a headline, Fauci announces that AIDS transmits in the household.
Jeez.
And it turns out to be completely false. A month later, when he's questioned about it, it's not, oh, I was in error, I made a mistake about the science. He just completely contradicts himself and pretends as if he has never said that. But meanwhile, the cat's out of the bag. The mythology of AIDS being transmissible through household contacts has already spread around the country, and now you have a political problem based on the misinformation that he's never held to account for.
I feel like that led to 10 years of people hovering over toilets.
Exactly. That was exactly it. And Fauci is one of the main persons to blame for that fault.
And real quick, piggybacking on his moral lie idea. So didn't he do the same thing with the herd immunity number, where he was basically saying that he was going to try to pump up the percentage needed so that people would get the vaccination?
Right. So when the vaccines were announced back in mid-November, Fauci, who for the previous 2 months had been saying, well, reinfections may cause herd immunity to not exist. Reinfections may threaten the strategy. He suddenly dropped all of that rhetoric for a couple of weeks and said, well, we'll reach herd immunity once we get 70 to 80% of the population vaccinated. That's our threshold. And people are like, okay, well, the end's in sight. We just get the vaccine out and distribute it, and we can get rid of all these mandates and lockdowns and masks. And Fauci's rhetoric actually kind of hinted at that. That lasted for like 3 or 4 weeks, and then I think it was mid-December, he came out with another press conference where he said, I was telling you 70 to 80% a few weeks ago, but what I really meant was 90%. And the only reason I said 70 to 80% is I was trying to nudge the public into greater acceptance of vaccines, but I really meant 90% all along, and I was just telling you a noble lie to get you there, to get you on board with my message. And people are hearing this, and it's like, wait a minute, this isn't a noble lie. You sound like you're just moving the goalposts for political reasons. So that lasted through December. And then all of a sudden, in late January or early February, he shifts again. And that's where we got the latest round of rhetoric where the South African variant is suddenly going to bring reinfections back onto the scene again. So he went from reinfections are not a thing a year ago to reinfections are a threat around the time of the Great Barrington Declaration to reinfections are not a thing again after the vaccines came out to doubling down that they were not a thing again by late December to his latest round with Rand Paul, where he's asserting the reinfections are again a specter and an existential threat to any repeal of the mandates and mask orders and lockdowns that he's been advocating for the last year or more.
Yes.
Listen, I guess this is the question I get asked. I don't even try to stab at an answer because I don't have one. What is the end game of all of this? Like, what is the end game? I don't grasp it. I don't get it. I guess I don't need it because I still can see what is right and what is wrong, what is likely and what is improbable. But it would be nice to have some idea of what are we all going for here. Any thoughts?
Well, I think one of the silver lining is I don't think Fauci has an end game either. He's just kind of making it up as he goes. And we've seen this through all of his pivoting rhetoric and pivoting rationales. So we may not know what the end game is, but I don't think he does either, even though he pretends to know. What I do see happening is going to be outside of the control of government, or it's also going to be relying on what we're seeing right now, and that's the variation in policies between some states that are reopening and others that are not. And that in itself is going to create, again, more natural experiments. I mean, we're seeing Florida and Texas are mostly open right now, and they're doing no worse than anywhere else in the country. And pretty soon that becomes too obvious to deny. You can't sit there and say, well, we need to keep New York locked down while people are watching on TV that life has returned to normal in Texas. Yeah, people start asking questions about that.
I'm hoping a bunch of people who are in New York or from New York who are now in Florida, when they come back, they can start at least diffusing the idea that, calamity is happening down there, because that seems to be the narrative. At any time New York is brought to Florida, regardless of what reality says, Florida and the governor down there is killing everybody, and we're thankful. We should be thankful to have Governor Cuomo as running New York.
Do you guys remember Georgia's experiment with human extinction or whatever it was at the Atlantic?
Exactly.
Human sacrifice.
That was April 2020. Georgia was supposed to be the next hotbed, and it never happened. Meanwhile, Cuomo was killing tens of thousands of people and covering it up in his nursing homes. And suddenly he's the savior. He's the person that did it right. There's another Fauci flip-flop. He announced that New York State was the model that the rest of the country should copy, and did that at multiple points.
Yeah, we haven't heard from him since.
That's frustrating living here. Dr. Fauci had no issue taking Ron DeSantis to task about it. It's very concerning seeing what's happening. Praising Cuomo's response. Cuomo gets caught red-handed covering up data in the midst of a pandemic, and Fauci has no comment.
It's very revealing about where the guy is politically. Yeah,
I'm just at a loss for words at that point. Like, that's just so disingenuous and hypocritical. I'm at a loss for words of how anybody can look at that and go, yeah, that seems legit. Makes sense.
Yeah,
it's fair.
All right, Mr. Magness, we're going to get you out of here. Is there anything that you're working on here? Doesn't have to be necessarily COVID related, but if it is, have at anything you're working on that you want to keep us on the radar about?
Well, I say just keep watching what the politicians are doing. Hold their feet to the fire. I am working on some longer-term projects about the pandemic as a failed experiment in central planning. In other words, lockdowns have a lot in common with what we saw in attempts to centrally plan economies, like in the Soviet Union or in Maoist China in the past. And those had horrific, disastrous results of their own right. But what we're seeing is a lot of the same problems play out when you try to do pandemic management based on imperfect information and political decision making that really takes the lead. And that's why you see things like some of these failed imperial college style COVID models have stayed with us and continued to guide policy for months or even a year after we already knew that they were failing. There's like a path dependency around the political system, the same way that the Soviet Union, even though its economy was failing, it lingered on for decades. I hope the lockdowns don't do the same thing, and I think that there will be faster pushback against them, but you start to see some of the same reasons why failed policies persist, even though everyone knows that they are failing.
I feel like it's just arrogance on the part of the planners and optimistic ignorance on the part of the followers of, for some reason, we cannot get over the idea that there exists a truly benevolent bureaucrat.
Exactly. In fact, we lionize them if they're Fauci.
Exactly. All right, Mr. Magness, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and keep up the good work. And everybody over there at the American Institute of Economic Research, you guys, everybody check them out. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.